She came home with a secret that should have saved their marriage. Instead, she found a secret that destroyed it. Amelia Voss stood frozen in the doorway of the penthouse she had decorated, in the bed she had slept in, watching the man she loved, the man whose child was already growing inside her, wrapped around another woman like she was the one who belonged there. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach, turned around, and walked out. If you've ever loved someone who didn't deserve it, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's begin. The morning Amelia found out she was pregnant, she burned her toast. It was a stupid small thing, the kind of detail that shouldn't matter, but she remembered it later with strange clarity. The smoke curling up from the toaster, the acrid smell filling the kitchen of their Zurich penthouse at 6:15 in the morning, and her standing there in Lucien's oversized shirt staring at the blackened bread like it had personally offended her. She'd been nauseous for 3 weeks and hadn't been able to eat anything that wasn't plain and warm, and now even toast was failing her. She threw it in the sink, drank water, pressed her back against the cold marble counter, and breathed. She'd taken 4 tests the night before. 4. Because one wasn't enough, because her hands were shaking too hard the first time, and she'd convinced herself she misread it, because the second and third left no room for doubt, and yet some stubborn, terrified part of her kept reaching for another box. All 4 sat in a plastic bag under the bathroom sink, wrapped in tissue like something shameful, though she hadn't decided yet if it was shame she was feeling or something closer to wonder. Lucien had come home at 2 in the morning. He always came home at 2 or 3, or sometimes not at all. She'd heard the elevator open, heard his shoes on the floor. That particular heavy sound he made, like the weight of whatever he carried, followed him through every door. And she'd lain still in the dark with her eyes open, listening to him move through the apartment. He hadn't come to bed. He rarely did anymore. That had been going on for 5 months, maybe 6. The exact moment things shifted between them was hard to pin down, the way it always is when a marriage doesn't break all at once, but slowly, quietly, like ice thinning from underneath. You walk on it every morning, assuming it'll hold, and one day it doesn't, and you were so used to the routine that you never felt the temperature change. She told herself it was the pressure of his work. Lucien Voss ran things. That was the cleanest way she'd ever found to describe what he did to people who asked, and most people in their circle knew well enough not to ask twice. He had holdings across 4 countries, sat on the boards of 2 legitimate shipping companies that were not, by any stretch of the imagination, primarily in the business of shipping, and there were men in European cities who said his name carefully, the way you might handle something with a known potential to cut. He had built all of it from almost nothing, through a combination of intelligence that genuinely impressed her even now, and a willingness to operate in spaces where most people's nerve broke. She had known what he was when she married him. She had not known what it would feel like to become furniture in his life. That morning she made herself eat half a banana, rinsed the black toast down the drain, and decided she was going to tell him. She'd practiced the words in the dark the night before, moving her lips without sound. She was going to walk into whatever room he was in and say, "Lucien, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a child." And she was going to watch his face and know, finally, where they actually stood. She'd spent so long not asking that question directly. This felt like the universe forcing her hand. She was supposed to have lunch with her friend Clara at 1. She called and canceled. Clara, who had known her since university, who could read her voice the way other people read text, immediately asked what was wrong. "Nothing," Amelia said, which Clara did not believe for a moment but had the grace not to push. She showered, put on clothes that still fit properly. That window was going to close faster than she was prepared for, and sat on the edge of the bed thinking about what she was walking into. The thing about Lucien was that he never showed fear. It wasn't performance. She'd learned the difference between a man performing confidence and a man who had simply wired himself so completely for control that even genuine emotion passed through some internal filter before it reached his face. She had seen him during a sit-down with a rival family in Milan, calm as someone waiting for a train, while the other man made threats that were not abstract. She had seen him on the phone getting news that 3 of his men had been arrested in Lyon, and he'd listened, said 4 words, hung up, and finished his coffee. She had never, in 4 years of marriage, seen him frightened. She used to find that steadying. Lately it just made her feel alone, His home office occupied the east corner of the penthouse, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the lake, a view that on most mornings was genuinely beautiful and that Lucian probably hadn't looked at in months. She knocked twice, she still knocked, though she wasn't sure when that had started, and pushed the door open. He was at his desk. He looked up, and the look on his face wasn't cold exactly, but it was occupied. The look of a man pulled briefly from one world into another and already calculating how quickly he could return. "I thought you had lunch with Clara," he said. "I canceled." He waited. She had practiced the words. Standing in the doorway with her hands loose at her sides, the floor cold even through her shoes, all the practiced words rearranged themselves into something she hadn't planned. "Are we all right, Lucien?" He set his pen down. Not fast, careful, the way he did things. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I haven't asked in a long time, and I should have." She held her ground. "Because you came home at 2 this morning, and we haven't eaten a meal together in 3 weeks, and I'm trying to figure out if we're going through something or if we're just done, and nobody told me." Something crossed his face, gone before she could name it. "I've been dealing with the Rotterdam situation," he said. "You know how the last quarter went." "I'm not talking about Rotterdam." "Amelia, I'm not talking about Rotterdam," she said again, quieter, and that quietness landed harder than raising her voice would have. "I'm talking about us. I'm talking about whether you still want to be married to me." Silence. The kind that has weight. "I'm not doing this now," he said. "When?" "I have calls starting in 20 minutes. She almost said it then. The words were right there. "Lucien, I'm pregnant. I found out last night there is a person growing inside me who is half you, and I need to know if you intend to be present for that or if I'm going to be raising our child in a marriage that's already a ghost." She almost said all of it. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment and said, "Okay," and walked out of the office and picked up her coat and her bag and left the apartment. She told herself she'd tell him tonight, when the calls were done. When the Rotterdam situation, whatever it was, had been handled and he had space to actually hear her. She walked along the lake for a while, sat on a bench, watched the water and pressed her palm flat against her stomach, the way she'd done in the kitchen that morning, that new involuntary gesture she was already developing, like she was confirming something to herself over and over. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, she forgot her scarf. It was a cashmere scarf, gray, a birthday gift from Clara 2 years ago. She remembered leaving it on the arm of the living room couch. She was cold, and the walk back was only 15 minutes, and she figured Lucien's calls would have started by then, so she wouldn't disturb him, she'd just be in and out. She didn't call ahead. It didn't occur to her to call ahead. The elevator opened directly into their private foyer, which required a key card. She used hers. The apartment was quiet in that specific way that meant no television, no music, the ambient hum of the ventilation, and nothing else. She stepped inside, set her bag on the foyer table, and walked toward the living room. She heard a voice, a woman's voice, low and specific in the way that stops you before your brain catches up. Later, she would try to remember exactly what she was thinking in the 6 or 7 seconds between hearing that voice and reaching the hallway and understanding what she was seeing. She didn't think she was thinking anything. The body understands some things before the mind will accept them, and it had already started making decisions. Her feet slowing, her breathing going shallow, the whole architecture of her certainty beginning to come apart. The bedroom door was open. She didn't go in. She stood at the end of the hallway, and she saw enough. Enough was not much. It was more than sufficient. The woman was dark-haired and younger, and she was in Amelia's bedroom with Amelia's husband in a way that left no interpretation available. Lucien's back was to the door. He didn't see her. She had exactly 2 seconds where she could have made a sound. Could have said his name, could have made any noise at all and forced the moment into confrontation. She didn't make a sound. Her hand went to her stomach. She turned around, walked back through the apartment, picked up her bag from the foyer table, and got back in the elevator. Her keycard was still in her hand. She put it back in her bag with the same careful, slow movement she might use handling something breakable. The elevator descended. She watched the numbers drop. When the lobby doors opened, she walked through them and kept walking. She didn't stop for 12 blocks. 12 blocks through Zurich's clean streets with the lake glinting somewhere to her left, and the afternoon light doing that particular pale gold thing it did in autumn, completely indifferent to what had just happened to her. She walked until her calves ached and her breathing came in long, effortful pulls, and then she stopped at the corner of a street she couldn't have named and stood there with her hands braced on her knees. She was not going to cry in public. She was not going to fall apart on a sidewalk in Zurich. Her phone buzzed. A message from Lucien. Calls are running long. Don't wait up. She read it twice. Then she put the phone back in her pocket. The thing she kept coming back to, standing there on that corner, was not the image of them together, though that was there too, etched in with the precision of something she'd never fully be rid of. It was the timing. It was that she had spent the night before holding 4 plastic tests in her bathroom, making herself ready to give him the most irreversible news 2 people can share, practicing the words, building herself up to it, and while she had been doing that, he had been... She stopped the thought. She called Clara. Clara answered on the second ring. I thought you canceled. Can I come to your place? A pause. Of course, Amelia. What? I'll explain when I get there. She got a cab. She sat in the back and looked out the window at the city and tried to figure out what she was going to do. That's the thing they don't tell you about moments like this. The shock doesn't turn you into someone who can't function. If anything, it sharpens you. Some survival mechanism kicks in, and suddenly everything is very clear and very simple, reduced to its essential question, which for her was, what do you do now? She had a child to protect. That had been true for 3 weeks, and she was only now, on the back seat of a Zurich cab, feeling the full weight of it. She was not just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting someone who didn't know yet that they existed in a world that could be this arbitrary, and this brutal, and this completely unmoved by what you deserved. She wasn't going back. She made that decision before she reached Claire's building. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel the way decisions feel in films, where there's music and weather changes and a visible shift in the protagonist's posture. It felt like the quietest possible thing, a door closing. Not slammed, just firmly, finally shut. Clara took one look at her and didn't ask questions, just poured 2 glasses of water, sat her down on the kitchen couch, and waited. That was the best thing about Clara. She had this extraordinary capacity for silence. He was with someone, Amelia said. In our apartment. She stopped. I saw them. Claire's face did several things in quick succession. Amelia, I didn't say anything. I left. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which surprised her, though she wasn't sure why it should. I'm not going back. Okay, Claire said. Just that. I need help. I need a ticket, I think, and I need to figure out where to go, and I need to do it fast, because if I think about it too long, She pressed her lips together. I'll talk myself out of it. You won't, Clara said. You're the least likely person I know to talk yourself out of something. I'm pregnant, Amelia said. The kitchen got very quiet. Clara put her glass down very carefully on the table and looked at her, and didn't say anything for so long that Amelia felt the first crack in the wall she'd been maintaining for the last hour. She felt her eyes sting. She blinked it back. He doesn't know, she said. I was going to tell him this morning, and then She made a short, exhausted sound. He doesn't know. Are you going to tell him? Amelia looked at the table. She thought about the bedroom door. She thought about the message on her phone. Don't wait up. She thought about what it meant to bring a child into a life built on fear and violence and deception, to let her child grow up learning what she had learned, that power is a substitute men use for love when love feels too risky. No, she said. It was the hardest word she had ever said. It was also the most certain. I'll get my laptop, Clara said. By 10 o'clock that night, there was a booking, a flight to New York leaving the following morning at 6:15. Clara had contacts, a friend from university who'd moved to Boston, a colleague in New York who had a spare room and no questions. She'd lent Amelia cash from her emergency envelope because Amelia wasn't willing to use cards that Lucien could trace. Not yet, not until she was far enough away that it didn't matter. Amelia sat on Clara's guest bed at midnight, her single bag packed. She'd taken almost nothing, only what she could carry easily, only what was irreplaceably hers, and held her phone. Lucien had not called, had not texted again after the first message. She thought about calling him, not to explain, not to fight. She was past both of those, but just to hear his voice one more time before she filed it away in the part of herself she was closing off. She thought about what she would say if he picked up. She couldn't find anything. She put the phone face down on the bed. In the morning, she would be on a plane. In 3 days, she would be in a city where she knew almost no one. In 7 months, she would bring a child into the world alone, without his name on any form that mattered yet, without his hand in hers, without any of the things she had once imagined surrounding that moment. She had chosen this. She needed to keep choosing it, every morning, or it wouldn't hold. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing. She put one hand on her stomach. "I've got you," she said to the dark room, to the small, fierce fact of the life inside her. "Whatever it costs, I've got you." She didn't sleep much. By 5, she was dressed and standing at Clara's door with her bag over one shoulder, and Clara hugged her for a long time without speaking, and then Amelia walked out into the cold Zurich morning and got in the cab, and the city went past the windows like something being erased. She did not look back. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, sitting in that cab with her single bag and her quiet, ironclad decision, was that 12 hours later, Lucien Voss would come home to an apartment that felt wrong before he'd taken 3 steps inside. He'd stand in the living room, noticing the small things she'd taken. The things only he would notice were missing because they were so specific to her. He would find no note. He would call her phone and hear it ring from the bedroom where she'd left it, charging on purpose. And the silence of that unanswered call would be the first moment the arrogance cracked, replaced by something he had no experience managing, genuine fear. But it would be too late. The elevator was already going down. She was already gone. And somewhere, in the quiet arithmetic of consequence, a child was already on its way into a world that Lucien Voss would not know about for a very long time. Lucien Voss had a system for everything. That was how he'd survived long enough to build an empire in the first place, not through brute force, though he was capable of that when circumstances required it, but through systems. Routines layered on top of routines, redundancies built into redundancies, contingency plans drafted before anyone else in the room had acknowledged that things could go wrong. He controlled his environment the way a surgeon controls a field, precisely, consistently, without sentiment. Sentiment was how men in his line of work ended up dead or worse, ended up owing something to someone they couldn't repay. So when Amelia left, the first thing that broke was the system. Not dramatically, not all at once. It started with the phone call she didn't answer, which he'd expected was a flat battery or a missed notification, and so he'd given it 20 minutes and tried again. Then the third call went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording, which he'd heard 100 times and somehow hadn't actually listened to in years. And that's when the first thing shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. He didn't do panic, but a recalibration. A new data point entering a calculation he hadn't known he was running. He found the phone on the charger in the bedroom. That was when he understood she'd left it on purpose. He stood holding her phone in the middle of the bedroom for probably 90 seconds, which was a long time for Lucien Voss to stand still doing nothing. He looked at the room. He looked at the bedside table where she kept 3 things: a glass of water, a book, and a small framed photograph of the 2 of them from the first year they were married, taken in Lisbon before everything calcified into what it had since become. The water was there. The book was there. The photograph was gone. She'd taken the photograph and left the phone. That was a message. It wasn't a note. Amelia was too deliberate for a note, too careful with words to commit anything raw to paper where it could be reread and weaponized. But it was a message. She'd thought about what to take and what to leave, and she'd chosen the photograph, the evidence that there had been a time when they were just 2 people in Lisbon who wanted to be near each other. He didn't call Adrian that night. Didn't call anyone. He sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink and went through everything in his head with the systematic thoroughness he applied to every problem, except that this problem didn't have the shape of anything he'd handled before. He could track a shipment across 3 borders. He could identify a leak in an organization of 40 men. He could negotiate with people who wanted him dead and leave the table intact. He had no framework for the possibility that his wife had simply chosen to disappear. He told himself she'd call by morning. She didn't call by morning. By the end of the first week, he'd confirmed through channels he wasn't proud of using that she'd taken a flight from Zurich to New York out of Cloton Airport at 6:15 on the morning after she left. He sat with that information for a long time. New York was enormous, and she had no family there, and the few friends he knew about in America were peripheral enough that he'd never bothered to remember their full names. He hadn't gone after her. That decision, the one he would spend the next 4 years excavating for justification and finding none, came from a place he didn't fully understand even at the time. Part of it was pride. The most honest part of him could admit that. He wasn't accustomed to chasing people. He wasn't accustomed to needing to. Part of it was the cold, defensive certainty that if she'd wanted to leave, then she'd already made her decision, and Lucien Voss did not beg. Part of it, and this was the part he buried deepest, was guilt. Not about the woman she'd seen, about everything. About the 5 months of silences and late nights, and the way he'd looked at her that morning in the doorway of his office, like she was an interruption when she was his wife, standing 3 feet away trying to ask him if they still had something worth saving. He told her he had calls at 20 minutes. She'd been trying to tell him something. He'd known that. He'd chosen the calls. He didn't go after her because some part of him believed she was right to go. That belief didn't make it easier. It made it significantly worse, in the way that all fair punishments are worse than unfair ones, because you can't even sustain the energy of resentment. You just have to absorb it. Adrian Keller showed up at the penthouse on the 8th day. Adrian was 43, trim in the way of men who maintained fitness as a professional discipline rather than a personal interest. And he had worked alongside Lucien for 14 years, since before Lucien had the penthouse, before he had Zurich, when they were both younger and harder, and operating out of a city that was less forgiving of mistakes. He knew Lucien's face well enough to read the things Lucien deliberately didn't show, which was more than almost anyone alive could claim. He came in, looked around the apartment, the unchanged rooms, the whiskey glass still on the coffee table that Lucien hadn't moved, he wasn't sure why, and said nothing for a moment. "She's not coming back," Lucien said. He wasn't looking at Adrian. He was at the window, the lake outside doing its indifferent morning thing. "You don't know that." "I know that." Adrian sat down without being invited, which was a liberty he'd earned. "What happened?" "She left." "I gathered that from the part where she's not here. I'm asking what happened." Lucien turned from the window. He looked at Adrian with the particular flatness that meant he was deciding how much to give. "She came home when she wasn't expected." A pause. Adrian's face didn't move. He'd always been good at that. "Isabel," he said, not a question. "Yes." "How long had she saw enough." Lucien crossed his arms, an unconscious self-containment. "She didn't say anything, just left." He paused. "She left her phone." Adrian let out a long breath through his nose. "Lucien, don't." "I'm not going to say anything you haven't already said to yourself." "Then don't say it again." The silence between them was the kind that had history in it. 14 years of history, enough shared damage to create a specific kind of shorthand where certain things didn't require elaboration. Adrian leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. "We have the Lyon situation coming to a head at the end of the month," he said. "Renard is pushing on the Rotterdam contract, and I can't stall him past Thursday without it reading his weakness. The Hargrove account needs your signature. I know what needs doing." "I'm not sure you do right now." Lucien looked at him. "I'm not saying that as an insult," Adrian said, meeting the look steadily. "I'm saying it because you're sitting in a room where you haven't moved anything in a week, and you're staring at a lake, and I've known you for 14 years, and I've never seen you stare at anything that long. You need to work. Give yourself something to focus on." He wasn't wrong. Lucien recognized that immediately, which was one of the things that made Adrian useful. He could deliver an accurate assessment without enough softness to make Lucien dismiss it as management. "Get Renard on the phone for Thursday," Lucien said, "and tell Hargrove's office I'll have the documents by end of week." "Good." Adrian stood. He picked up his coat, then stopped. "Are you going to find her?" "No." "Why not?" Lucien turned back to the window. "Because she made a choice. I'm going to respect it." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "That's not like you." "Maybe it should have been." He threw himself into work the way men like him always do when they have nothing else. Completely, with the focus of someone trying to outrun something that moves at the same speed they do. The Lyon situation resolved. The Rotterdam contract was restructured to Renard's marginal satisfaction. The Hargrove account cleared. 2 months passed, then 3, and Lucien moved through his empire with the efficient joylessness of a man fulfilling obligations and nothing more. He did not contact Amelia. He told himself it was respect for her decision. Sometimes he almost believed it. The woman she'd seen, Isabel, was gone from his life the day after Amelia left, ended with a phone call that lasted 40 seconds. He didn't think about her. He hadn't thought much about her even when she was present. That was the honest truth of it, and the honesty of it made him feel worse, not better. It hadn't been love or want or any of the things an affair should be if it's going to justify the damage it does. It had been inertia. The path of least resistance dressed up as something it wasn't. A man who'd stopped doing the difficult work of being present to his wife, finding it easier to be present somewhere with lower stakes. He despised himself for it with the consistent, low-grade clarity of someone who has identified a flaw they can't currently fix. On the 4th month, he fired 2 men from his Brussels operation for skimming accounts. He restructured his Rotterdam network. He met with 3 separate parties about an expansion into the southern ports. He was efficient and precise and entirely miserable in a way that he kept private because he had no one he could show it to without it reading as weakness. Adrian was there, always. Meetings and calls and the constant tactical management of an empire that required daily attention. Adrian had opinions about everything. The Brussels restructure, the Rotterdam expansion, the Southern Ports deal, and they were usually good opinions, pragmatic and sharp, and Lucien found himself increasingly relying on them in a way he hadn't before. When you're absent from yourself, you lean on what's available. He didn't notice, in those months, how comfortable Adrian was becoming in the space Lucien's distraction had vacated. You rarely notice that kind of thing until later, when it's too late to have mattered. Amelia had a son in February. She was in a hospital in Brooklyn, 23 hours of labor, that she got through with Clara on the phone from Zurich and a midwife named Donna, who had the unadorned competence of someone who had seen every possible version of this and found all of them manageable. There was no one holding her hand. That had been her choice. She'd had months to arrange it otherwise, but she hadn't because bringing anyone into the room meant explaining things, and she wasn't ready to explain yet. The boy was 7 pounds, 2 ounces, dark hair. Dark eyes that would either stay dark or shift. It was too early to know. She named him Noah. She lay in the hospital bed in the hours after, the room quiet. Noah asleep in the clear plastic bassinet beside her, and she looked at his face for a long time. She was looking for Lucien in there and finding him, finding it unmistakably. The shape of the forehead, something about the set of the jaw, even in a face this new. She had known it would be there. She had made her peace with the fact that some part of the man who'd broken her would exist in the person she loved most in the world. She looked at her son and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. Something more fundamental. The quiet, heavy recognition that her life had an axis now. Everything would arrange itself around this sleeping 7-pound person, or it wouldn't arrange itself at all. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm your mother. I want you to know I've got a plan." He slept through it. She appreciated that. What followed was not glamorous. The spare room in New York became a small apartment in Brooklyn, found through a contact of Clara's, and Amelia furnished it with the specific resourcefulness of someone operating on a budget constructed from a mix of her own savings, a loan from Clara that she was absolutely going to repay, and the fierce refusal to ask for anything from Lucien's direction. She'd left with what she could carry. She was building the rest herself. She got work. Her background was in arts administration. She'd managed a gallery in Basel before she married Lucian and slid gradually into the life of a woman whose husband's world consumed everything else. She still had the skills, slightly rust-edged, and New York had galleries. She did freelance work first, project management for a small contemporary space in Williamsburg that couldn't afford a full-time operations person, which meant she was working flexible hours she could structure around Noah's schedule. She was exhausted all the time. Not the desperate can't-function exhaustion, she'd feared that, but the pervasive load-bearing tiredness of a woman who is doing 3 people's worth of work with none of the infrastructure that's supposed to exist for it. She slept in fragments. She ate standing up over the kitchen counter. She had conversations with Noah that were half-functional narration. We're putting the jacket on now, the left arm first, here we go. And half something more honest, the kind of talking you do to another person when they can't yet respond, and so you can say the true things without managing their reaction. She told him about Zurich, not the version she'd tell him when he was older, the edited one that protected him from what he couldn't use yet, but the full version, because he was 3 months old and the only judge in the room was herself. She told him she didn't regret leaving. She told him she did regret not saying anything. Sometimes, not the confrontation, but the silence. The way she'd turned around and walked out without making Lucian look at her and account for what he'd done. She'd told herself at the time it was dignity. Some mornings it felt more like she'd handed him a clean exit from a guilt that should have weighed on him longer. She didn't regret not telling him about Noah. She had rebuilt that decision from the ground up multiple times in the years since she'd made it, and she had always arrived at the same place. To bring Lucian into this child's life was to bring everything attached to Lucian, and she had made a promise to 7 pounds of sleeping person in a Brooklyn hospital that she intended to keep. She kept it. The gallery work became steadier. By the time Noah was 18 months old, she was managing a mid-sized space in Chelsea with actual hours and actual health insurance and the particular satisfaction of being competent at something again after years of being adjacent to someone else's competence. She had a woman named Priya from the building who watched Noah on the days the gallery needed her in person. A compact, matter-of-fact arrangement that worked because Priya had no interest in Amelia's backstory, and Amelia had no interest in performing one. She built a life. It was smaller than the one she'd left, and she was tired in a way she suspected was now permanent, but it was hers in a way that the Zurich penthouse, with its lake views and its marble counters, had never fully been. She did not tell Clara to relay her location to anyone. She did not reach out to Lucien. She checked sometimes. She'd search his name and find the same results she always found: the shipping company press releases. The occasional business item from a Rotterdam or Lyon trade publication, nothing that would tell her anything real about who he was now, or whether any of it had changed him. She never looked long. She'd close the window and go back to whatever she was doing and feel something she couldn't precisely name, not longing, she was past that, but the specific ache of a story you left before the ending, the not knowing that lives at the edge of almost every decision you make out of survival. She was building. She was okay. She was not going to be the woman who looked back and stumbled. What she didn't know, couldn't know, running the gallery and raising Noah and becoming, by degrees, someone new, was that 400 miles away in Zurich, in the office with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the lake that nobody looked at, something had been found. A file. Old medical records routed through a clinic in the 3rd arrondissement of Geneva that Amelia had visited twice in the autumn before she left. The records had been requested by someone with enough access to the right administrative channels to obtain them, and they had landed on a desk in that glass-walled office without warning on a Thursday afternoon in late March, 4.5 years after the elevator doors had closed and she had been gone. Lucien Voss sat at that desk and read the records twice. Then he sat very still for a very long time. Prenatal blood work. Dated the week before she left. He was a father. He had been a father for 4 years, 3 months, and approximately 11 days, and he had not known because she had not told him, and she had not told him because he had given her no reason to believe he deserved to know. And the full weight of that particular chain of cause and effect settled onto him in that glass-walled office above the lake, like something that had been waiting at altitude for a long time and had finally decided to fall. His hands were flat on the desk. He looked at them. They were steady. They were always steady. It was the one physical thing he'd never lost control of, but he looked at them like they belonged to someone he was only now meeting. He had a child. Amelia had been pregnant the morning she stood in his office doorway and asked him if they were all right, and he had told her he had calls at 20 minutes. He had a child, and he had never once. He stood up from the desk. He didn't call Adrian. He didn't call anyone. He walked to the window and looked at the lake he never looked at, and for the first time in 4.5 years he felt something crack open in him that he had no system for managing, no protocol to apply, no contingency plan drafted in advance. He had a child somewhere in the world, and that child did not know he existed, and that was, without competition, the most devastating thing he had ever been responsible for. And he had been responsible for things that other men had nightmares about. He picked up his phone. He opened a contact he had not opened in 4 years. He stared at it. Then he put the phone down, walked out of the office, and went to find the one person who he believed could help him locate her. Not through surveillance, not through the channels he used for problems, but through the kind of honest reckoning that couldn't be delegated or systematized or handled by anyone other than himself. What he didn't yet know, what none of the records could tell him, what no channel he had access to would reveal for another 72 hours, was that in those same 72 hours, someone else already knew where Amelia was. Someone who had known for much longer than Lucian had, who had been watching the situation develop with the patient, calculating attention of a man who understood that information is only useful when deployed at precisely the right moment. The file on Lucian's desk had not arrived by accident. Someone had put it there, and the person who had put it there was sitting, at that exact moment, in a car 2 blocks from a gallery in Chelsea, watching a woman he had never met lock the front door and turn up her collar against the wind and walk toward the subway with her shoulders straight and her chin level, walking exactly like someone who had decided not to be afraid anymore. He watched her until she turned the corner. Then he made a phone call. "It's done," he said. "He knows." The call Lucian made was to a man named Reeves, not Adrian. That was the first decision, and he made it instinctively. The way you make decisions when something below the level of conscious thought has already processed information your front brain hasn't caught up with. He stood in the corridor outside his office with his phone in his hand and scrolled past Adrian's name without stopping and called Reeves. Thomas Reeves, who ran a small private intelligence firm out of Copenhagen and who owed Lucian a favor that had been sitting uncollected for 3 years. Clean, separate, outside the organization's normal channels. Reeves picked up on the 3rd ring. "I need a location," Lucian said. "Someone who left Switzerland 4.5 years ago. Last confirmed destination was New York." "Name?" "Amelia Voss. She may be using her maiden name, Amelia Crane." A pause on the line. Reeves was cautious in the way of men whose entire professional value depended on being cautious. "This is a personal matter?" "It's the only thing I've ever called you about that is." Another pause. "Give me 72 hours." "You have 48. He hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment longer, looking at nothing, then went back into the office and closed the door and sat down at his desk and looked at the medical records again. Not because he needed to reread them, because he needed to make himself keep looking at them until they felt real, the way you press on a bruise to confirm it's actually there. Prenatal blood work. Her name at the top, her date of birth, the Geneva Clinic's letterhead. She had been 8 weeks along when these were taken. He had done the math 3 times in his head since reading the file. 8 weeks before she left, which meant she had known, had been sitting with the knowledge, for at least a month before the morning she stood in his office doorway asking if they were all right, and he had told her he had calls. He pressed the heel of his hand against his sternum. There was a pressure there that hadn't been there an hour ago. He recognized it intellectually as grief, or something in the same family, though he had limited personal experience with the sensation and almost no vocabulary for managing it that didn't involve converting it into something actionable. He needed something actionable. He opened his laptop and started building a list of everything that would need to be handled, delegated, or suspended if he had to travel. The Rotterdam expansion had a decision point in 6 weeks. Lyon was stable. The Brussels operation was running clean since the restructure. Adrian could manage the interim period, Had done it before during Lucian's more complicated trips, knew the organization's rhythms well enough to hold things steady for 3 or 4 weeks without the whole apparatus drifting. He would go to New York. He would find her. He would not call first because calling first gave her the option to disappear again, and he was not equipped to absorb another disappearance. He would go and he would stand in front of her and he would say, he didn't know yet what he would say. He would find the words when he could see her face. Words were more reliable that way, anchored to a real moment rather than rehearsed into something false. He was already thinking about what he owed her son. His son. The phrase sat in his chest like a stone. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the living room, the same room where he'd sat with the undrunk whiskey on the night she left, and went through it all again, every sequence, every choice, following the chain of consequence backward to its source with the methodical attention he gave to postmortems on operations that had failed. He did this not to punish himself, though it functioned that way, but because he needed to understand the shape of what he'd done before he could make any credible argument for being allowed near the people he'd done it to. By 4 a.m, he had a reasonably complete accounting. It wasn't flattering. He hadn't expected it to be. Adrian came by the following afternoon. He came unannounced, which he did sometimes, a habit Lucien had never corrected because Adrian's unannounced visits were usually useful. He had a nose for moments when Lucien needed input and hadn't yet asked for it. He let himself in with the key Lucien had given him years ago for emergencies and found Lucien in the kitchen, which was where Lucien spent the least amount of time and therefore the most reliable indicator that something was wrong. "You didn't answer my calls this morning," Adrian said. He set his coat on the back of a chair. He looked at Lucien with the careful, calibrated attention he always used. The Renard people want an answer by Friday on the Southern contract. "Tell them yes on the terms we discussed." "I did. They want it in writing from you." "I'll send it tonight." Lucien was standing at the counter with a coffee that had gone cold, not drinking it. He looked up. "I'm going to New York." Adrian's face stayed neutral. "When?" "End of the week. Possibly sooner. The Rotterdam decision point is in 6 weeks. If you're not here to..." "You can manage it. You've managed harder things." He set the coffee cup down. "I need you to hold things together here for a month. Maybe less. A beat." Adrian sat down at the kitchen table, unhurried. "Does this have to do with Amelia?" Lucien looked at him. "I'm asking because you've been unreachable for 24 hours and you look like someone excavated you," Adrian said, "which in 4 years of watching you deal with her absence hasn't happened before. So something changed." "Something changed. Are you going to tell me what?" He owed Adrian an explanation. That was the pragmatic truth of it. He was asking him to run the organization for a month, and the man deserved context. "I found out she was pregnant when she left," Lucien said. "I have a child." Adrian's face went very still. Not the careful, managed stillness he usually maintained, something different, something that in a different context Lucien might have identified and filed away. But he was tired, and he was looking at his cold coffee, and he let it pass. "A child," Adrian said. "A son. He's 4 years old. She's been in New York." "How did you find out?" "Medical records. Came through the administrative channel, someone in the Geneva clinic system." He shrugged slightly. "I don't know who pulled them. Someone with access. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that I know and I need to, He stopped. "I need to fix what I can fix." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "She kept it from you for 4 years. She had reasons. She kept your son from you, Lucien. I know what she did." His voice was flat. "I also know what I did before that. Don't try to make this something it isn't." Adrian raised both hands, the gesture of a man backing off a position, and nodded. "All right. When do you leave?" "I'll let you know. I'll handle Rotterdam, and I'll talk to the Brussels people about the quarterly review." He stood, picked up his coat, paused at the kitchen doorway. "Be careful in New York. I'm going to see my wife and son, not negotiate a treaty." "I know." Adrian looked at him for a moment with an expression Lucien couldn't immediately parse. "Just be careful." He left. Lucien heard the elevator open and close. He stood in the kitchen for another minute, then picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway because he needed something to do with his hands. Reeves came back in 36 hours, not 48. Chelsea. A gallery called the Crane Gallery. She'd used her maiden name for the business, which was either deliberate distance from his or simply practical, and he suspected both. An apartment in Brooklyn, address confirmed. A son enrolled in a nearby preschool under the name Noah Crane. Noah. He said the name once, quietly, in the empty office. It landed in a way he hadn't anticipated. A name was different from a fact. A fact was data to be processed. A name was a person who existed in the world independently of whether you knew about them, who had already been alive for 4 years, who had likes and habits, and a voice Lucienne had never heard. He booked the flight for Thursday. He told no one except his housekeeper that he'd be away. He did not bring security, a decision that went against every protocol he'd maintained for years. But something about arriving in front of Amelia with armed men behind him felt like exactly the wrong message. He would be alone. He could manage whatever needed managing alone. Wednesday night, he packed a single bag. He sat on the edge of the bed, their bed, still theirs in the technical sense, though she'd been absent from it for 4.5 years, and thought about what he would say. He still didn't have the words. He'd decided to stop trying to manufacture them in advance. The words would come from whatever was true in the moment, and if they didn't come, he'd stand there until they did. He slept 4 hours. He was at the airport by 5. The gallery was closed on Mondays. He found that out standing on the sidewalk on West 24th Street at 2 in the afternoon, looking at the hours posted in the window, which he should have checked before flying across an ocean, but which had not occurred to him because he had spent 48 hours operating on a forward momentum that left no space for the mundane logistics of gallery hours. He stood on the sidewalk. People moved around him in the specific, indifferent way of New York pedestrians who have seen every possible version of a man standing lost on a sidewalk and have no capacity left for curiosity about it. He looked at his own reflection in the gallery window. The glass was dark enough to give him back a dim image of himself, a tall man in a charcoal coat looking older than he'd expected. And then he looked past his own reflection at the interior of the space, clean white walls, a handful of paintings he couldn't see clearly, a desk near the back with a lamp left on. Her name on the door, Crane Gallery. Her maiden name. Her life, rebuilt from the materials she'd had available while he'd been in Zurich running an empire he no longer found meaningful. He went to find coffee. He would come back tomorrow. The coffee shop was 3 doors down, small and warm, and he sat at a window table for an hour and a half watching the street with the patience of a man who had once sat in a car outside a rival's warehouse for 11 hours waiting for the right moment, and could therefore handle an hour and a half in a coffee shop without difficulty. The patience was genuine, but the stillness underneath it wasn't. Underneath it was the kind of cellular restlessness he hadn't felt in years, since the early days when the stakes were personal and immediate and you could feel them in your teeth. He went back to his hotel. He would come Tuesday. He came Tuesday at 10 in the morning, and he stood across the street and he watched her unlock the gallery door from the outside. She had changed. Not unrecognizably. She was still Amelia, still the particular way she carried herself, shoulders level, chin up, the walk of someone who had made a decision about how they intended to move through the world, but something in the overall quality of her presence was different. Harder, maybe. More deliberate. The kind of change that comes from years of being the only one responsible for something and getting used to it. She was wearing a gray coat. She had a coffee in one hand and a bag over her shoulder, and she was looking at her phone while she fitted the key into the door, and she did it without looking, which meant she'd done it so many times it had become unconscious, and there was something about that mundane competence that hit him in the chest harder than he'd expected. He crossed the street. She heard him before she saw him, or felt something, the way you feel a change in the air before you identify its source. And she looked up from her phone. She looked at him. She didn't move. He stopped 6 feet away. The street moved around them. Someone on a bicycle went past. A bus hissed at the corner. Everything continued at the same pace, entirely unmoved by the fact that these two people were standing on a Chelsea sidewalk looking at each other for the first time in 4.5 years. "Hello, Amelia," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Her face was doing several things, moving through a sequence he couldn't fully read. Not because she'd become harder to read, but because there was so much there, layered, and he'd forfeited the right to be fluent in her expressions. "How did you find me?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "Does it matter?" "Yes." Her voice was level. "It matters quite a lot." "A contact, someone who owed me a professional favor." He held her gaze. "I didn't use anyone from the organization." She looked at him for another moment, then turned back to the door and finished unlocking it. She pushed it open. She didn't tell him to come in, and she didn't tell him to leave, which he interpreted correctly as the narrowest possible invitation, and stepped inside before she could change her mind. The gallery was warm and smelled like paint, and something floral, a candle or a diffuser somewhere he couldn't see. She moved behind the front desk with the efficient purpose of someone getting a room ready rather than welcoming a guest. Turning on a second lamp, setting her bag down, pulling up something on the computer that she immediately minimized when she decided she didn't want to be doing two things at once. She turned and looked at him. He was still standing near the door. He'd kept that deliberate distance, not wanting to be in the room wrong. "You know," she said. Not a question this time either. "Yes." "The medical records?" "Yes." She nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone receiving information they'd long anticipated and still find difficult in the actual moment. She put both hands flat on the desk, not leaning, the posture of someone grounding themselves. "How long have you known?" 6 days. "And you came straight here?" "After 48 hours to confirm your location, yes." She looked at her hands on the desk for a moment. Then she looked up and her eyes were dry, completely dry. The eyes of a woman who'd had years to pre-process every version of this conversation. "What do you want, Lucien?" "To see him," he said, "and to—" He stopped. "To say what I should have said 4.5 years ago, before any of it happened." "You had 4.5 years." "I know." "You didn't come." "I know." He didn't flinch from it. "I was wrong. There's no version of what I did that holds up. I know that." She studied him with the specific attention of someone determining whether a thing is real or performance, and the fact that she couldn't immediately tell, the fact that she had to look that hard, told him exactly how much he'd spent. "Noah is at preschool until 3, she said finally. "You're not meeting him today." "I understand. You don't get to meet him because you showed up. That's not how this works." "I know. I need to—" She pressed her lips together. "I need time to think about how to even begin to explain to a 4-year-old who you are. And I need to believe before I do that you're not going to be something I have to explain away afterward." "That's fair," he said. "It's not about fair." Her voice sharpened, the first crack in the levelness. "Fair doesn't live here. Fair left when you were with someone else in our bedroom. This is about Noah. Entirely about Noah, you understand that?" "Yes." She held his gaze for another moment, then looked away, out the front window at the street. He watched her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she breathed through the moment, controlled but not effortless. "Come back Thursday," she said. "We'll talk. Not about Noah yet. About you. About what you think you're doing here, and what it's going to cost, and whether you have the capacity to actually be what this requires." She looked back at him. "Because what this requires is not what you've ever done before." "I know that too." "Thursday," she said. 10 o'clock. He nodded. He picked up nothing because he'd brought nothing in. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "His name," he said. "Noah." Something moved across her face, just briefly. "Yes." "It's a good name." She didn't respond to that. She turned back to her computer, and he understood the dismissal and respected it, and he walked back out to the Chelsea street and stood in the wind for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, breathing the cold air, and thought, Thursday, 2 days. He could manage 2 days. He was wrong about that, not about managing the wait, about the assumption that 2 days was the variable that mattered. He was in his hotel room that evening when his phone buzzed, a message from a number he didn't recognize at first, then placed immediately. One of the burner lines that cycled through his Brussels network for communications that needed to stay off the main channels. The message was 4 words. Check your hotel room. He was already in his hotel room. He looked up from the phone slowly, scanning the space with the instinct of someone who has walked into rooms that weren't safe before and learned to read them quickly. Nothing looked different. Nothing looked wrong. The room was the same room he'd checked into the previous day. Standard layout, window on the east wall, closet to his left. The closet door was fractionally open. He'd left it closed. He crossed the room in 6 steps, opened it fully. On the floor of the closet, propped against his unopened suitcase, was a manila envelope. Sealed. His name on the front in block letters, handwritten with the particular evenness of someone printing deliberately to obscure their natural hand. He picked it up. He carried it to the desk. He sat down and opened it. Inside were photographs. 12 of them, printed on standard paper, the quality of something pulled from a surveillance feed rather than a camera. The timestamp in the corner of each image was from the past 72 hours. He went through them one at a time. The first 3 were photographs of the gallery. Amelia arriving, Amelia leaving, Amelia at the front window. The next 4 were of the preschool. He identified it from the signage over the door. The photograph showed children in the yard, and in 2 of them, visible among the group, a small, dark-haired boy he had never seen before, but recognized with a certainty that bypassed rational confirmation entirely. Noah. Someone had been watching them. Not Reeves. Reeves was Copenhagen-based and wouldn't risk this kind of direct insertion into a hotel room. Someone else. Someone who knew Lucien was here and wanted him to know that whatever protection he thought his distance from the organization provided, it wasn't covering Amelia and Noah. The last photograph in the envelope was different from the others. It wasn't surveillance footage quality. It was sharper, deliberate, taken from a closer range. It showed Amelia on the subway platform, the previous evening by the timestamp, waiting for a train. She was alone. The platform was not crowded, and standing 20 feet behind her, visible in the frame, was a man Lucien recognized, not by name, by the small tattoo on the left side of his neck. A detail visible only because the image was sharp, and Lucien had a very good memory for men who worked for people he knew. He'd seen that tattoo once before, 3 years ago, in a room in Antwerp during a meeting that had been arranged through Adrian's contacts. He set the photograph down. He sat very still for a long time. Then he called Reeves. "The records," he said, the moment Reeves answered. "The Geneva medical records." "Who pulled them?" A silence. "I told you they came through an administrative—" "Who pulled them?" His voice had dropped to the register that meant the conversation had changed categories. "Not who routed them. Who initiated the request." Another silence, longer. "Lucien, if you're asking what I think you're asking, I'm asking you a direct question." The silence on the line was the silence of a man calculating what honesty was going to cost him versus what a lie would eventually cost more. "The request originated from an internal flag," Reeves said carefully. "Someone within your organization's administrative network put a watch on records associated with Amelia Voss 2 years ago. When the system found a match in the Geneva Clinic archive, it automatically routed to the source of the request." "Who was the source?" Reeves said the name. Lucien sat with the phone held very still against his ear. He looked at the photograph on the desk. He looked at the man with the tattoo standing 20 feet behind Amelia on a subway platform. Adrian Keller had found out about Noah 2 years before Lucien had, and he had sat across from him in this apartment's kitchen 48 hours ago with a completely still face and said, "A child," like he was hearing it for the first time, and then he had said, "Be careful in New York." And Lucien had taken that as the concern of a loyal man. It was not the concern of a loyal man. He understood now what the photographs in the hotel room were. They weren't a threat delivered by an enemy. They were a message from someone who had access to his organization's resources, who knew exactly where he was and exactly where Amelia was, and had been watching both of them long before this week. Someone who had decided, for reasons Lucien could not yet fully map, to surface the information about Noah now, to bring Lucien to New York, to put him in proximity to his family at a moment of Adrian's choosing rather than his own. He thought about the Rotterdam expansion, the Southern Ports contract, The steady incremental way power had redistributed itself through the organization during 5 years of Lucian's distraction. The way Adrian had always been there, always available, always managing. Managing the situation, managing the relationship, managing Lucian's information environment with the careful invisible hand of someone who had learned that the most durable kind of control looks indistinguishable from loyalty. He thought about Amelia closing the gallery tomorrow, picking up Noah from preschool, walking to the subway, completely unaware that she was already inside a situation she had never agreed to enter. He picked up a second phone, a separate line, prepaid, purchased at JFK the day he arrived because some habits from the early years never fully left, and called a number he had not called in over a year. A man named Casimir, who operated out of Warsaw, and who was one of 3 people in Lucian's broader network who reported to no one except Lucian directly and who Adrian did not know existed. "I need eyes on a location," Lucian said. "Starting tonight. A gallery in Chelsea and an address in Brooklyn. I'll send both." "How many?" "Enough." He looked at the photograph of the subway platform. "And Casimir, this is off every channel you normally use. Nothing digital, nothing that touches the organization's network. You call me on this number and only this number. Understood?" "Understood. Do you want to tell me what we're watching for?" Lucian looked at the 12 photographs spread across the hotel desk. He looked at his son's face in the preschool yard photograph. A dark-haired boy he had never met, 4 years old, standing in a patch of afternoon sunlight in Brooklyn, with no idea that the world his father had built was currently rotating slowly to place him at its center. "We're watching for men who are already there," he said. He hung up. He looked at the photographs for another moment, then stacked them carefully and put them back in the envelope and put the envelope in the inner pocket of his coat. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, the grid of it, the density, the complete indifference of 10 million people going about their lives. He had come to New York to ask Amelia's forgiveness. He had come to meet a son he'd lost 4 years of. He had come prepared to give up whatever she required, to rebuild whatever she would allow, to be patient with the slowness of it, and earn every inch. He had not come to fight. But Adrian Keller had just moved Amelia and Noah onto a board that Lucian hadn't known he was playing on, and that meant the man who had sat across from him for 14 years, the man Lucian had trusted with his organization, his schedule, his absence, his most protected information, had been managing Lucian's life from the inside for longer than Lucian could yet calculate, and the reason for it was something Lucian needed to understand before another 24 hours passed. Because whatever Adrian was building toward, he had chosen this moment to accelerate it. The ruthless, systematic part of Lucian Voss, the part he'd been trying to retire, the part that had built an empire out of controlled violence and information and the willingness to do what other men refused, came back online with a clarity that felt, despite everything, like something clicking into its correct position after years of being misaligned. He was not going to let his family become leverage. Not for Adrian, not for anyone. He had one day before Thursday, one day before he was supposed to walk back into that gallery and sit across from Amelia and have an honest conversation about whether there was anything worth salvaging between them. He was still going to have that conversation. He was not canceling Thursday. But between now and Thursday, he needed to understand the full shape of what Adrian had constructed, because you cannot protect people from a threat you haven't mapped, and he had a son in a preschool yard in Brooklyn who had no idea his existence had already been weaponized by a man in Zurich who had been waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to use it. He picked up the prepaid phone again. He began to make calls. Not the calls of a man trying to save his empire. He was past caring about the empire with a completeness that surprised even him. The calls of a man who has identified the single thing that matters and is reallocating every resource he has left toward protecting it. Because when it finally comes to the question of what you're willing to burn, some men discover too late that the answer is everything, and some men discover it just in time. Lucien Voss had spent his life being too late. He was not going to be too late for this. The first thing Casimir reported back was that the man with the tattoo had not left. He was still in the neighborhood, different positions, outside the gallery on Tuesday morning, then 2 blocks east near the subway entrance by afternoon, then gone for 6 hours before reappearing near the corner of Amelia's Brooklyn Street at 9 in the evening. Patient, rotating but not leaving. That was the operational signature of someone maintaining coverage rather than conducting a single observation. Which meant he wasn't alone, because one man can't maintain continuous coverage of two locations across two boroughs without a rotation behind him. Casimir confirmed the rotation by midnight, 3 men total, all carrying the specific posture of trained personnel, not police, not private security in the conventional sense, but the loose-limbed, heads slightly down, always facing exits kind of alert that Lucian recognized from the inside. These were his own people, or they had been. He sat with that for exactly as long as he could afford to. Then he called Casimir back and said, "Nobody moves on them yet. I need another 12 hours." He needed the 12 hours because before he dismantled Adrian's surveillance net around Amelia and Noah, he needed to understand the full scope of what he was dismantling. You pull one thread without knowing how the structure is built, and the whole thing collapses in the wrong direction. He had seen that happen to other men's operations, and he was not going to let it happen here, not with his son's preschool on the other end of the equation. He spent the night reconstructing it, calling people he hadn't called in years, not for favors, but for information, specific, granular, verifiable. What contracts had moved through Adrian's desk independently in the last 24 months? What personnel decisions? What communications had been routed through Adrian's secondary channels? He was building the map backward, from the known points outward, and what assembled itself over those hours was not the picture of a loyal second-in-command holding things together during his boss's distraction. It was the picture of a man who had used that distraction as a construction period, who had been, for approximately 3 years, quietly installing himself as the operational center of an organization that still technically belonged to someone else. Adrian hadn't wanted the organization to collapse without Lucian. He'd wanted to inherit it intact. And Lucien, in his grief and his guilt and his 5 years of going through the motions, had handed him the tools to do exactly that and then stayed out of the way while he used them. By 4 in the morning, Lucien had enough to understand the shape. Not every detail, some of that would take weeks to fully excavate, but the essential structure. The Rotterdam expansion was Adrian's, designed to give him direct control of the port contracts independent of Lucien's signature. The Southern Ports deal was the same. The Brussels restructure had placed 3 of Adrian's personally loyal men in positions that now reported to him rather than to the organization's original hierarchy. It was patient, professional work, the kind you could only do if you had years and the confidence that the person above you was sufficiently absent not to notice. He'd had both. What Lucien couldn't yet determine was why the photographs. Why surface Noah's existence now? Why, after 2 years of knowing and not revealing, had Adrian chosen this particular moment to bring Lucien to New York? He turned that question over for a long time. He thought about it the way he thought about chess problems. Not from his own position, but from Adrian's, trying to inhabit the logic, find the move that made sense given the board as Adrian saw it. And what he eventually arrived at, sitting in a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan at 4:15 in the morning, was something that made his hands go very still on the desk. Adrian didn't bring him to New York to reunite him with his family. He brought him to New York so he would be here instead of there. Out of Zurich, out of the organization. Distracted by the most powerful distraction a man can have, a child he'd never met and a woman he'd never stopped. His phone buzzed. Casimir. "Something's moving," Casimir said. "The 3 I had eyes on, they just went from maintenance coverage to active positioning. 1 is outside the gallery, 2 are in Brooklyn near the apartment building." Lucien was on his feet before Casimir finished the sentence. "What time is it?" 4:22. She wouldn't be at the gallery at 4 in the morning. The apartment. That's what I'm thinking. Call the other 2 off the gallery. All 3 of yours go to Brooklyn. Nobody moves on Adrian's men yet. Just maintain position and do not let them into that building. He was already putting his coat on, phone wedged between his ear and his shoulder, moving toward the door. "I'm 12 minutes away." "Lucien." Casimir's voice had a particular flatness that meant what he was about to say was not good. "There may be more than 3. I was watching the confirmed ones. If he has additional personnel I haven't identified, I know." He was in the corridor, moving toward the elevator. Go. The cab ride was 11 minutes. He spent 8 of them on the phone, and 3 of them watching Brooklyn get closer through the window with the specific focused emptiness of a man who has switched off everything that isn't immediately necessary. He was not thinking about Amelia sleeping in the apartment unaware. He was not thinking about Noah in whatever small room served as his bedroom, also unaware. He was thinking about entry points, about what resources Casimir had physically available, about whether Adrian's personnel had orders to wait or orders that were already in motion. He was thinking about what Adrian wanted, not the organization. He'd been taking that incrementally for 3 years without needing this. He wanted something specific, something that required Lucien to be in New York, away from Zurich, with his attention on Amelia and Noah, which meant whatever Adrian was executing right now, it needed Lucien absent from the other theater while it happened. His phone buzzed again. Not Casimir. A number from Zurich, one of the organization's administrative staff, a woman named Petra, who worked the overnight logistics desk and who had never called him at 4 in the morning in the 6 years she'd worked for him. He answered, "Petra, Mr. Voss?" Her voice was careful in a way that meant she was not alone or was afraid of being overheard, or both. "I'm calling because—" A pause, almost imperceptibly short. "Because there are men here." "In the building?" "Yes. Mr. Keller's people. They're going through the offices, the financial records, the contracts, the Rotterdam files." Another pause. "Mr. Keller told the overnight staff it was a scheduled audit. At 4 in the morning." "Yes." So there it was, the full shape of it, finally visible. Adrian had sent Lucien to New York with the medical records, sent men to watch Amelia and Noah to keep Lucien occupied and emotionally entangled, and while Lucien was 11 minutes away from Brooklyn in a cab at 4 in the morning with his heart rate elevated for the first time in years, Adrian was in Zurich conducting the final transfer. The documents, the contracts, the financial infrastructure that would legally consolidate control of the organization under his name before Lucien could return to contest it. It was, objectively, very good strategy. Lucien could recognize that even now, sitting in the cab with his jaw tight and his hands absolutely still in his lap, it was exactly what he would have done, which was the thing about Adrian that he had always known and apparently not adequately accounted for. The man had learned everything he knew from Lucien himself. "Petra," he said, "don't do anything. Answer whatever they ask, cooperate with whatever they tell you. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Get me a list. Tonight, whenever you can do it without being seen, of everything they've accessed and copied. Every file." "Yes, sir." He hung up. The cab was stopping. He handed the driver cash without calculating it and was on the sidewalk in Brooklyn at 4:31 in the morning, and Casimir was already there. A compact man in a dark jacket who materialized from a doorway with the practiced casualness of someone who had spent years doing exactly this. "Building's still quiet," Casimir said. "Both of Adrian's men are on the street, one on the north corner, one at the building entrance." How obvious. Obvious enough that they're not trying to hide, which means either they're waiting for a signal or they've already been told they won't need to hide. "They're waiting." Lucien looked at the building entrance, a 5-story walk-up, brick, the kind of building where the front door buzzed and the hallways were narrow. "Adrian doesn't want them here for the operation tonight. He wants them here so that I know they're here." Casimir looked at him. "Insurance. He wants me to know that they can get to her and the boy whenever he decides, so that when I get back to Zurich and find out what he's taken, I understand the terms of the conversation we're going to have." He looked at the man on the north corner, early 30s, heavy-set, hands in his jacket pockets, standing like someone waiting for a bus that he already knows the schedule of. He's not going to move on them, not yet, not while he still needs the leverage to be credible. "You're sure?" "No," Lucien said, which was the honest answer, "which is why you're going to stay on this building until I tell you otherwise." He walked toward the entrance. She opened the door in a bathrobe with her hair down, and a look on her face that moved through 3 distinct expressions in under a second, startled, then angry, then calculating, and said, It's 4:30 in the morning. I know. He was keeping his voice down, aware of the building around them, the sleeping floors above. I need you to listen to me. Lucienne, there are 2 men outside your building who work for someone in my organization. He watched her face. They are not going to come in tonight, but they are there, and I needed you to know. She stared at him, whatever she'd been prepared to feel about seeing him again, and he suspected she had prepared for a lot. This was not in any version she'd rehearsed. He could see the recalibration happening behind her eyes. Come in, she said. The apartment was small and warm and genuinely lived in. The particular texture of a space where a child spent time, small shoes by the door, a drawing taped to the refrigerator visible from the hallway, books stacked with the organized imprecision of someone who reads constantly and shelves things loosely. He stood in the middle of it and felt, for a strange sliced moment, the full weight of all the mornings he had not been here. Then he put it away. He could not afford it right now. She was standing with her arms crossed, not the defensive posture, the containing posture, holding herself in. Talk, he told her. The condensed version, the operational facts without the emotional scaffolding, because she needed information, not his feelings, and he understood the difference. Adrian, the medical records, the men outside, the operation in Zurich happening right now. He gave it to her straight, and he watched her absorb it with a steadiness that should not have surprised him. She had spent 5 years becoming someone who absorbed things steadily, but that still landed in him somewhere deep. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, he's been watching me for 2 years. Yes. While you didn't know I was here. Yes. She unfolded her arms. She pressed one hand flat against the kitchen counter. Why? Why does he want me involved in this at all? He doesn't. He wants you accessible, as a pressure point. As long as he can reach you, he can control the terms of any confrontation with me. He paused. I'm going to make sure he can't reach you, but I need to move quickly, and I need you to trust me enough to follow specific instructions for the next... I don't trust you. Her voice was flat. Not cruel, just precise. I don't trust you yet. That's where we actually are. I know. So don't ask me for trust. Tell me what you need me to do for Noah's safety and I'll decide. He nodded. That was fair. That was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years, possibly, and he respected it so completely he had to look away for a second before he could answer. I need you and Noah to move, not permanently. I'm not asking you to leave your life here. For 72 hours, a location that isn't connected to either of us, that Adrian's people can't have mapped. He looked back at her. Is there someone? She thought for a moment. He could see her running through her list of people the way he'd run through his the night before, applying the same filter. Who is outside the network? Who can't be traced back? Clara's cousin lives in Philadelphia, she said. She and I have met twice. There's no professional connection, no social media connection, nothing on paper. She looked at him. What about Noah? He has preschool tomorrow. He doesn't understand why... I know. I'm sorry. And he was. The plainness of it, the intrusion of this into a morning routine a 4-year-old depended on. It's 72 hours. I will handle what needs to be handled in Zurich, and I will call off Adrian's people, and when you come back it will be... He stopped. I will fix it. That's all I can tell you. She looked at him for a long time. She was measuring something she hadn't decided on yet. Then she said, if anything happens to my son because of you or your world, we are done. Every version of whatever this is, done. You understand that? Yes. Go sit in the living room. I need to wake him up, and I don't want him to see you for the first time at 4:30 in the morning while I'm packing a bag. He went and sat in the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch beside a small pile of children's books and a stuffed animal that had been through significant use and looked at the drawing on the refrigerator that he could partially see from where he sat. A house with a large sun. 2 figures, one tall and one small, both with dark hair. He looked at the 2 figures for a long time without moving. He heard her voice from down the hall, low and warm, the particular register of a mother waking a sleeping child gently. He couldn't make out the words. He heard a small voice respond, confused and sleepy, and then her voice again, still low, steady, the voice of someone making the unfamiliar feel safe. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat with it. Then he heard small feet on the floor. Noah appeared in the hallway wearing pajamas with rockets on them, hair flattened on one side, holding the duplicate of the battered stuffed animal from the couch. It was a rabbit, he could see now, and the one in the hallway was clutched by one ear. The boy stopped when he saw Lucian and looked at him with the complete, unguarded directness of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to manage his own curiosity. Lucian did not move. Noah looked at him for a full 5 seconds. Then he said, "You have the same hair as me." Lucian's throat did something he wasn't prepared for. He swallowed it. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Mama says we're going on a trip." "Yes." "Is it a fun trip?" He looked at this child, this 4-year-old person who had been alive for 4 years and 3 months in a world that Lucian had not known about, and who was standing in a hallway at 4:30 in the morning, asking with complete sincerity whether the unscheduled trip was going to be fun. And the particular quality of the question, the openness of it, the absence of any guile whatsoever, hit Lucian somewhere so far below his usual operating level that he had to consciously maintain the steadiness his face required. "I hope so," Lucian said. Noah considered this. Then he went back down the hall. Lucian heard him telling Amelia, "He said he hoped so." He heard Amelia say, "Okay, buddy, let's get your shoes." He put them in a car at 5:15, not a cab, Casimir's man, a vehicle that wasn't traceable through any channel Adrian had access to. Amelia came out with Noah on her hip and a single bag, and she looked at Lucian on the sidewalk with an expression that was too complex to name, something between exhaustion and an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to speak yet. "Philadelphia," he said. "Tell Clara's cousin not to use her phone for anything that isn't an emergency." "I know." She paused. Noah was looking at Lucian again from her hip, with that same steady, assessing attention. "How will I know when it's safe?" "I'll call this number." He handed her a card. "Just a number, nothing else. When you hear my voice and I say the word Thursday, it's safe. If I use any other word, you move again. Casimir's man will leave you a number." She took the card. She looked at it, then she looked at him. "Don't die," she said. Not sentiment, instruction. The kind of practical directive you give someone who is about to walk back into something dangerous when the outcome of it matters to you more than you've decided to admit yet. "I'll do my best," he said. She got in the car. Noah's face appeared in the rear window as the car pulled away, looking back at the sidewalk, looking at Lucian standing there in the pre-dawn Brooklyn street, and he raised one small hand in what might have been a wave and might have been just the gesture of a 4-year-old pointing at something that interested him. Lucian raised his hand back. The car went around the corner. He stood for a moment on the empty street. Then he looked at Casimir. "Pull your people off here. I need them in Zurich by tomorrow morning." Casimir raised an eyebrow. "You're going back." "Tonight's flight, if there's a seat." "What about Adrian's men?" Lucian looked at the corner where the car had disappeared. He thought about the man with the tattoo. He thought about the photographs of Noah in the preschool yard. He thought about Adrian sitting across from him in the kitchen 2 days ago, saying, "Be careful in New York," with the face of a man who already knew every reason Lucian should be careful and had arranged all of them personally. "They'll follow me," Lucian said. "Once they know I'm at the airport, they'll report that the subject is in transit and Adrian will pull them. He doesn't need them here anymore once I'm heading back. That's the whole point. He wants me back in Zurich, walking into the situation he's arranged." He paused. "Make sure they see me at the airport." "You want them to confirm your departure." "I want them to tell Adrian that I'm coming home angry and alone." He picked up his phone. He started walking. "What Adrian doesn't know yet is what I'm bringing with me." The flight boarded at 7:40. He sat in the seat and looked out the window at the runway and went through his mental inventory one more time with the exhaustive precision of a man who cannot afford an error. Casimir, arriving in Zurich in a separate flight 2 hours after his. 3 additional contacts, men who owed him and who Adrian had no record of, who existed in the private margin of Lucien's operations that he'd always maintained separate from the main organization, a contingency he'd never expected to need for this particular purpose. Petra, inside the building, who would confirm the documents Adrian had copied and where they'd been transferred. A lawyer in Geneva, clean and independent, who was going to be very busy in the next 48 hours establishing certain things about the legal ownership structure of the organization's assets before Adrian could complete his transfer. It wasn't enough to dismantle what Adrian had built, not in 48 hours, but it was enough to stop the bleeding, to prevent the final consolidation, to keep the organization from completing the transfer before Lucien could contest it. And then there was the conversation, the one that Adrian didn't know was coming, because he thought he was expecting an angry man walking back into a situation he'd engineered. He didn't know that Lucien had spent the flight home not being angry. Anger was what Adrian had planned for. He didn't know that Lucien was coming back in the particular cold, systematic mode that he'd built his empire in, the mode where everything except the objective was noise, where every resource was a tool and every tool got used. He knew where Adrian would be. That was the last thing Petra had confirmed before she'd gone quiet. Adrian was using Lucien's office. Had been for 2 days. Was conducting the final documentation process from the desk with the lake view, which was, in a way that Lucien found almost impressive in its audacity, exactly what he would have expected from a man who'd been planning this long enough to stop being subtle about it. The plane lifted off the runway. Lucien leaned back and closed his eyes. He thought about Noah's face in the rear window, the small raised hand, the rocket pajamas. He thought about what it was going to mean to walk back into that organization and do what needed to be done. The person that was going to require him to be for the next 48 hours. Not the man he'd been trying to become for Amelia, not the father he owed a boy in rocket pajamas, but the earlier version, the one made of systems and cold air and the willingness to press on a thing until it broke. He was going to have to be that person one more time. He was going to try very hard to make it the last time. The city fell away below him. The Atlantic opened up ahead. He felt the altitude change in his ears and the particular quality of above-cloud light, white and directional and absolute, and he sat in it with his eyes closed and breathed and thought about a house and the drawing on Amelia's refrigerator, 2 figures under a sun, and the specific weight of his own son's eyes looking at him from across a hallway as if he were something worth examining carefully before deciding about. He was not going to let Adrian Keller have any of it. Not the organization, not the leverage, and absolutely not one more day of proximity to a woman and a 4-year-old boy who had already survived enough damage tracing back to decisions Lucien had made. The plane broke through the clouds. Below, the Atlantic was dark and enormous and completely indifferent, and ahead, somewhere at the end of 9 hours of flight, was a glass-walled office above a lake where a man who had learned everything from him was sitting at his desk, believing he had already won. Lucien opened his eyes. He looked at the horizon. He thought, not yet. The plane landed at Zurich at 11:40 in the morning, local time, under a sky the color of old concrete. Lucien moved through the terminal without pausing. No checked luggage, nothing that required waiting. He had slept 3 hours on the flight. Not enough, but sufficient, the body doing what it needed to do with what it was given. He felt the specific quality of tired that sits behind the eyes and in the joints, the kind that doesn't go away with coffee, that only resolves when the thing demanding it of you is finally finished. He'd been running on that fuel before. He knew how long it lasted if you were careful with it. Casimir's man was at the arrivals level in a gray sedan, engine running. Lucien got in without a word, and the car moved immediately. In the back seat was a phone, different from the prepaid he'd used in New York, another layer out, and a single sheet of paper from Petra passed through a channel Adrian hadn't thought to monitor because it was so old it predated his involvement in the organization entirely. A courier. Actual paper. Lucien had used that channel once before, 12 years ago, during a period when he couldn't trust his own phones. He read the sheet. Adrian had completed the transfer of the Rotterdam contracts to a shell entity at 9 that morning. The Southern Ports documentation was still in process, requiring a secondary signature from a board member Adrian had not yet been able to pressure into compliance. The financial reserves, a specific account in Basel that represented the organization's liquid operational capital, Had been accessed but not fully moved. Pending authentication. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. He had a window, narrow but real. "The lawyer," he said to Casimir's man. "Confirmed. He's been at his office since 7. The filing is prepared." "How long to execute?" "He said 90 minutes once you give the authorization." "Call him. Tell him to begin." The car moved through Zurich's morning traffic, the city doing its clean, orderly thing, entirely indifferent to the fact that a significant restructuring of one of its more quietly significant financial enterprises was currently in motion. Lucien looked out the window at streets he'd driven 1,000 times and felt something he couldn't name precisely. Not nostalgia, he wasn't built for nostalgia, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that you are looking at something for what may be the last time and choosing to look at it clearly rather than sentimentally. He had built this here. From very little in a city that rewarded control and punished visibility, he had built something that had lasted and grown and sustained itself for 15 years. He was not proud of everything it had required. He was honest enough not to pretend it had been built on clean materials. But he had built it, and now he was going to dismantle it. Not let Adrian take it. Not allow 15 years of structure to be inherited by someone who would use it with none of the particular restraints Lucien had eventually, imperfectly, developed. But actually take it apart himself, deliberately, so that neither of them had it. That decision had come somewhere over the Atlantic, somewhere between closing his eyes and opening them, and it had arrived with the completeness of something that had been true for a while and simply needed the right altitude to become visible. The car stopped 2 blocks from the building. Lucien got out. He walked the rest of the way. The building's lobby staff did not react to seeing him, which meant Adrian either hadn't anticipated a same-day return or had instructed them to behave normally, and either possibility suited Lucien equally. He took the elevator to the executive floor and stepped out into the corridor and walked toward his own office with his coat still on and his hands loose at his sides. Petra was at the desk outside the office. She looked up and something moved across her face. Relief, he thought. The specific relief of someone who has been managing a situation they didn't sign up for and can now hand it to someone more equipped for it. She said nothing. She glanced at the closed office door and then back at him, the most minimal possible communication. He nodded once. He knocked on his own office door and pushed it open without waiting. Adrian was at the desk, Lucien's desk. He had his jacket on, which was interesting. He hadn't made himself comfortable, which suggested some part of him had been tracking the clock, monitoring the airport, maintaining enough awareness to not fully settle into the position before it was locked in. There was a laptop open in front of him, a coffee cup, several folders arranged with his characteristic precision. He looked up. He did not look surprised, exactly. He looked like a man encountering a variable he'd assigned a low probability to and was now recalculating around with the practiced speed of someone accustomed to recalculating. "You made good time," he said. Lucien closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at Adrian at the desk, his desk, and gave himself 5 full seconds to simply look, to let the full reality of the last 72 hours, every piece of it, be present in the room without managing it. "Get out of that chair," he said. Adrian held his gaze for a moment. Then he stood, unhurried, the motion of a man making a choice rather than obeying a command. He moved around the desk and stood beside it with his arms at his sides, and for a long moment the two of them simply occupied the room across from each other, 14 years of shared history arranging itself in the air between them. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow at the earliest," Adrian said. "I know." "You've spoken to someone inside." He wasn't asking. "Yes." Adrian looked at him with the careful attention he always used when he was reassessing a situation. "The Rotterdam documents are filed. The shell entity is in the process of being legally challenged as of 40 minutes ago," Lucien said. "The Geneva lawyer has the filings. The authentication on the Basel account has been frozen through a court order that will hold for at least 10 days. He paused. "The Southern Ports documentation won't complete because the board member you needed, Hargrove's representative, was contacted by my lawyer this morning before you could reach them." Something crossed Adrian's face. Not quite surprise. The specific expression of a man watching a movie he'd underestimated arrive in full. "You moved fast," Adrian said. I've been moving since 4 in the morning." Lucien crossed his arms. While you were here executing the final steps, I was already inside them. He looked at Adrian steadily. You taught me how to think that way, which is the problem with teaching people everything you know. The silence between them had a different quality now. Earlier, it had been strategic, the calibrated silence of two men managing information. Now it was something rawer, the silence of an old equation reaching its terminal point. I want to understand one thing, Lucian said. Not the strategy. I've mapped the strategy. I want to understand the decision. 2 years ago when you found out about Noah, you had leverage you could have used immediately. Instead, you sat on it for 2 years. He looked at Adrian. Why? Adrian considered that for a moment. He looked at the window, the lake view, the one no one ever looked at, and then back. Because 2 years ago you were still here, he said. Still running things, still present enough that moving on you would have been a direct confrontation I wasn't sure of winning. He said it without apparent shame, the delivery of a man who has made peace with what he is. I needed you distracted first, properly distracted. The organization running smooth enough that your absence wasn't destabilizing, but you personally removed from the center of it. He paused. The boy was the right instrument for that. Nothing removes a man like you from his operational focus like an unresolved personal debt. Lucian listened to this. He listened to all of it with the same flat attention he'd give to a post-mortem on any failed operation. You used my son. I used information about your son, Adrian said with the precision of someone who has rehearsed the distinction. The boy himself has been in no danger. I had men watching them, not threatening. I know what your men were doing. They were insurance. Lucian's voice hadn't risen. That was the thing Adrian had never fully understood about him. The temperature of his voice had an inverse relationship to the severity of what he was communicating. You put men with guns in proximity to my 4-year-old son to ensure my compliance. That's what happened. Adrian said nothing. 14 years, Lucian said. That's what I want you to account for. Not the organization, not the contracts. 14 years. 14 years of doing things that needed doing while you were building something that was always going to become too comfortable, Adrian said. And now there was something in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not anger, but a particular bitterness, long maintained, the flavor of a grievance that has been held so long it has fermented into something else entirely. You built it, and then you started getting soft. A wife, a penthouse, lunch meetings with men who should have been afraid of you. The Rotterdam expansion should have happened 4 years ago. I brought it to you 4 years ago, and you sat on it because you didn't want the exposure. The southern ports were the same. Every move that should have consolidated this organization into something permanent, you deferred or diluted because you'd gotten comfortable. He looked at Lucian. I didn't take anything from you. I finished what you stopped being willing to finish. Lucian held his gaze through all of it. He let it land. You're right that I changed, he said. You're wrong about what that means. He moved toward the desk, his desk, and sat in the chair that Adrian had vacated. He did it without drama, a simple reassumption of position. I changed because I finally understood that everything we built here, every expansion and contract and piece of leverage, none of it was enough. Not for what it costs, not for what it takes from the people near you. He looked at Adrian across the desk. You think I went soft? What actually happened is that I did the math, and the math didn't work anymore. And now? Now I'm going to finish dismantling what you tried to take. The legal challenge will hold. Rotterdam goes back to the original structure. The Southern Ports deal is dead. I'm not signing it, and without my signature, it has no standing. He paused. The organization will be wound down over the next 18 months through a structure my lawyer is building today. Contracts transferred, assets liquidated, personnel given terms and released. Clean, legal, nobody goes to prison if they cooperate with the process. Adrian stared at him. You're killing it. Yes. Everything we built, 15 years, it's mine to kill, Lucian said simply. You never owned it. You managed it. There's a difference, and you've always known there was a difference, which is why you needed the documents. He sat back. You're going to cooperate with the wind down. You're going to return the Rotterdam documentation and acknowledge the legal challenge. In exchange, your personal accounts aren't touched, and you walk away with your freedom. He looked at Adrian. That's the offer. It doesn't improve with time. The room was very quiet. Adrian stood with his arms at his sides, and Lucien could see him working through it. The angles, the remaining leverage, the calculation of whether there was a move left that Lucien hadn't already countered. He was watching a very intelligent man arrive at the conclusion that the board had been cleared while he was watching the wrong pieces. "The men in Brooklyn," Adrian said. "They had other instructions. Instructions I haven't recalled." "I know." Lucien looked at him. "Recall them now, while I'm watching." Another long moment. Then Adrian picked up his phone. He made a call that lasted 45 seconds. Lucien watched him make it. He heard the other end of it. The pickup, the short instruction, the confirmation. He heard the call end. "Done," Adrian said. "I know," Lucien said again. Casimir confirmed it 30 seconds ago. He held up the prepaid phone in his hand briefly, showing Adrian the confirmation text that had arrived while Adrian was dialing. "I had people on them." Adrian looked at the phone. He looked at Lucien, and something in his face shifted. Not defeat exactly, but the departure of a particular kind of energy. The investment leaving. He sat down in the chair across the desk, the chair on the other side, the one where visitors sat, where men who needed something from Lucien had always sat, and he sat in it like someone suddenly aware of what it had always meant to be in that chair. "What happens to me?" he said. Not a threat, a genuine question. "You leave Zurich," Lucien said. "You don't operate in any market where this organization has had presence for a minimum of 5 years, and you don't contact me, Amelia, or my son, under any circumstances, ever." He paused. "Those are simple terms, and they're the only ones being offered." Adrian was quiet for a moment. He looked at the lake through the window. "I spent 14 years on this," he said. "I know." "Doesn't that count for anything?" Lucien thought about it honestly. He gave the question the real consideration it deserved, because Adrian had done 14 years of hard and often genuinely skilled work, and the fact that it had curved eventually into this didn't retroactively erase all of it. "It counts for the terms I just offered," he said, "which are generous, given what you put your men near in Brooklyn. I want you to understand how generous they are." Adrian understood. He nodded once, the nod of a man closing an account. He stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He left the laptop on the desk. It was Lucien's equipment anyway. And he left the coffee cup, half full, and he walked to the door and stopped with his hand on it. "For what it's worth," Adrian said, "she turned you into something better." He didn't turn around. "I didn't see the value in that. That was probably my mistake." He opened the door and walked out. Lucien sat at his desk and listened to the sound of the elevator opening and closing, and then the silence that followed, and he looked at the lake. He actually looked at it. The water, the autumn light on it, the far bank. He sat and looked at it for probably 5 minutes, which was the longest he'd ever looked at it, and it was in fact quite beautiful, the way things usually are when you finally stop moving fast enough to see them. Then he picked up the clean phone and dialed the Philadelphia number. It rang twice. "Thursday," he said. A pause on the line. Then Amelia's voice, slightly rough from the tension of the last 30 hours. "Is it over?" "The immediate part. The rest will take time." Another pause. He heard something in the background. A child's voice, asking something he couldn't make out. The particular persistent inquiry of a 4-year-old who has been in an unfamiliar place for 24 hours and wants to know the status of everything. "He's been asking about you," Amelia said. She said it carefully, like she was handing him something fragile and wasn't fully sure yet whether his hands were steady enough for it. "Since this morning, he keeps saying, 'the man with the same hair.'" Lucien's chest did the thing it had been doing intermittently since the hallway in Brooklyn. He didn't try to manage it this time. "How long before you can get back?" "Tomorrow. If you're sure it's clear." "Casimir will confirm the all clear through his man tonight. He'll drive you back from Philadelphia." He paused. "Amelia." "What?" "I ended it. The organization. Not transferred, not restructured. I'm winding it down entirely." He heard her breathe on the other end of the line. 18 months, legal process. It will be clean. After that, there's nothing left of it. The silence on the line was a different kind of silence from the ones they'd had before. Not the silence of distance or avoidance or carefully managed hurt. The silence of someone receiving something they'd stopped expecting and needing a moment to figure out where to put it. "Why are you telling me that?" she said finally. "Because you deserve to know that it's real, not a negotiation tactic, not a concession I'm making to gain access." He looked at the lake. "Because I need you to understand that I know what it cost. Everything that happened, the years, what you built alone, what Noah didn't have and should have had. I know what it cost, and I'm not asking you to forget it." He stopped. "I'm just asking for Thursday." A long pause. "Come on Thursday," she said. 10 o'clock. And she hung up. He sat with the dead phone in his hand for a moment, and then he set it down on the desk beside Adrian's abandoned coffee cup, and he sat in his office above the lake for a little while longer, not working, not planning, just sitting in the particular quiet of a room where something large has recently concluded. He was at the gallery at 9:58 on Thursday morning. He made himself wait on the sidewalk until 10 because it was the kind of thing that mattered, the small demonstrations of the ability to stay inside agreed terms. He had a coffee from the place 3 doors down. He'd been back twice since Monday, enough that the person at the counter recognized him with the undemonstrative acknowledgement of a New York coffee shop employee who has seen everything and graded none of it. At 10, he walked to the gallery door. It was already unlocked. He pushed it open. Amelia was at the back desk. She looked up. She was in dark clothes, hair pulled back, and she looked like someone who had also not slept especially well in the last 3 days and was managing it with the same sustained competence she seemed to apply to everything. She looked at him with an expression that he couldn't fully translate. Too many layers, too much history, too much of the last 5 years compressed into the particular way she held her face when she was deciding how to be in a moment. "Coffee?" she said. "I have one." "Okay." She gestured at the chair across from the desk. The same minimal invitation as Tuesday, the same narrow opening that he understood was all he was going to get and accepted accordingly. He sat down. She sat. They looked at each other across the desk in the warm gallery light, with the sound of the street outside and the specific knowledge of everything that had happened and everything that had been said in their previous conversations, and the much larger weight of everything that hadn't. "How is he?" Lucian said. "Good." He was thrilled about the Philadelphia trip by the end of it. "Clara's cousin has a dog." A brief pause. "He asked about you again this morning." "What did you tell him?" "That we were going to talk today, that you were someone important." She held his gaze. "I didn't tell him who you are yet. That's a conversation that I need to plan, and I need to do it right, and I need—" She paused. "I need to know first what you're actually offering, not the organization ending, not the dramatic gesture. What does this actually look like in practice?" He'd thought about this on the flight, and in the hotel, and on the sidewalk this morning. He'd thought about it with the same systematic thoroughness he gave to operational questions, and arrived at answers that were honest rather than optimized, which was the main difference between this and every other strategic problem he'd ever worked on. "I stay in New York for as long as it takes to be something real to him," he said. "Not visits. I'm here. I find a place. I'm available, say, school pickups, sick days, the ordinary things. Whatever he needs." He looked at her. "For you, I don't ask you for anything you're not willing to give. I don't push a timeline on what we are or aren't. I understand what I did, and I understand that understanding it isn't the same as having paid for it." He paused. "I will earn whatever I get to keep. That's what I'm offering, the work. Every day, without guarantee of outcome." Amelia listened to all of it. She looked at her hands on the desk, then back at him. "You know what the hardest part was?" she said. "Not the affair. Not even leaving." She looked at him with the direct, calibrated honesty he'd always found. Even when they were at their worst, one of the things he most respected about her. "The hardest part was watching you not come. Knowing you knew I was gone, and choosing not to come, and having to decide whether that was because you didn't care or because you thought I didn't want you to." She paused. "I spent a long time not knowing which it was." "Both?" he said. "In proportions I'm not proud of." She nodded slowly. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "I have a lot of ground to make up on honesty." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile. Something earlier than a smile. the facial precursor to one, the muscle memory of it beginning to resurface. "You do," she said. "Then I'd like to start." She looked at him for a long moment. She was doing the thing she always did when she was making a real decision. Not the managed, deliberate kind, but the kind that comes from wherever decisions actually come from, below the level of strategy. He sat and let her do it without filling the silence, which was maybe the most important thing he'd learned in the last 5 days about what she needed from him and hadn't been getting. "He gets out of preschool at 3, she said finally. "If you want to be there." He looked at her. The full weight of what that meant. Standing at a preschool at 3 in the afternoon, waiting for a dark-haired boy in rocket pajamas, who called him the man with the same hair, landed in him completely, without management. "Yes, he said. "I want to be there." "Then be there." She stood. She picked up a file from the desk and moved around it toward the back of the gallery, back to work, back to the life she'd built that was still going to be her life, regardless of what he was or wasn't now. Then she stopped. She looked back at him over her shoulder. "The school is on DeGraw Street. Don't be late." He notices things like that. He stood. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman who had left with nothing and built something from it and raised a person and survived and kept her back straight through all of it. And he felt something that he didn't try to name and didn't try to compress into something manageable. He just felt it, standing in a gallery in Chelsea, and let it be the size it actually was. "I won't be late," he said. He was at DeGraw Street at 2:45. He stood on the sidewalk outside the low brick building with its painted fence and its paper artwork taped in the windows, and he felt more exposed than he had at any point in the last 72 hours. More than the confrontation with Adrian, more than the pre-dawn Brooklyn street, because this had no system behind it. No preparation he could do, no contingency plan. He was just a man standing on a sidewalk who had no idea yet how to be what was required of him and was going to have to learn it in real time, one day at a time, starting now. Other parents arrived. He stood to one side, coat collar up against the October wind, hands in his pockets. He got a few of the glances that strangers in a small, consistent community give to someone new and unknown, quickly assessed and filed. At 3:04, the doors opened. Children came out in the specific organized chaos of small people released from a contained environment, each one scanning for their particular adult with the focused laser attention that children have for the faces that belong to them. He watched them come out, and he was looking for dark hair and a specific face, and he found it. Noah, backpack larger than logically necessary for a 4-year-old, looking around the way kids do when the pickup arrangement is slightly different from usual, and they're doing the quick recalibration. Noah's eyes found him. He stopped. He looked at Lucien with the same complete, unguarded directness as the hallway in Brooklyn. Then he looked around for Amelia, a quick checking scan, and then back at Lucien. Lucien crouched down to his level. He did it without thinking, the instinctive physical adjustment of an adult trying to be at eye height with a small person. And he looked at his son's face from 3 feet away in the afternoon light on a Brooklyn sidewalk and tried to find what you say to someone you've owed everything to for 4 years and are only now, finally, showing up for. "Hi," he said. "I'm Lucien." Noah looked at him seriously. "I know," he said. "Mama said." "She did?" "She called me from the car." He shifted his backpack with the practiced efficiency of someone who has worn it every day. "She said you were going to pick me up and that you're important to us." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a child processing something carefully. "Are you going to come every day?" Lucien held his gaze. He felt the full scope of the question, the simple, devastating directness of it, the way children ask the most essential things without any of the protective hedging that adults develop to keep themselves from being disappointed by the answers. "I'm going to try," he said. Noah considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he held out his hand, small and warm and entirely certain of itself, and said, "Okay, can we get a snack? There's a place on the corner that has the good pretzels." Lucien looked at the offered hand. He took it. They walked toward the corner, his son's hand in his, and Lucien Voss, who had run an empire built on fear and systems and the relentless conversion of everything soft into something hard enough to use, felt the specific weight of 4 years of lost ordinary afternoons settle into him all at once, not as punishment, but as the precise measure of what he was being given a chance to reclaim, day by day, pretzel by pretzel, one 3 o'clock pickup at a time. He had burned the empire. He had faced what he'd built and what it had cost, and he had chosen, finally, the right thing to protect. It had cost him everything he'd spent 15 years accumulating. It had cost him nothing he couldn't live without. The corner pretzel place was warm and smelled like salt and dough, and Noah explained with great seriousness the difference between the soft pretzels and the hard ones, and why the soft ones were correct. And Lu Zetian listened to every word of it with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has recently learned, at considerable expense, that this is what attention is actually for. Outside the window, the city moved at its ordinary pace. The lake was 4,000 miles away. The glass-walled office above it was being methodically emptied by people his lawyer had engaged to begin the wind down, folder by folder, 15 years of construction going the other direction at last. He didn't think about it. He listened to his son talk about pretzels. That was enough. That was in fact everything. And across the city, in a gallery on West 24th Street, Amelia Voss stood at the front window in a moment between tasks and looked out at the afternoon light on the street and let herself feel, carefully and without rushing it, the first tentative shape of something she'd packed away a long time ago in a cold Zurich morning and carried with her without opening since. Not trust yet. Not forgiveness. Not fully. Those were slower things, and she wasn't going to rush them for anyone. But the possibility of them, the door to them, cracked open just enough to let in a thin line of light. She stood at the window for another moment. Then she went back to work. The story didn't end with a single clean moment. It didn't end with everything repaired, because some things don't repair. They scar over, and you carry the scar and learn the weather by it. It ended with a man and a small boy splitting a soft pretzel on a Brooklyn afternoon, and a woman across the city choosing, one more time, to keep the door open. It ended with the ordinary, irreplaceable, endlessly renewable fact of another day in which the worst hadn't happened and the best was still possible, and the people you loved were, for now, safe and present and real. That was the victory. Unglamorous and complete. The empire was gone. The family remained. And that, in the end, was the only arithmetic that had ever mattered.